everybody. Episode 710 of the podcast in Assuming America, the Air Tour Sports Podcast presented by BetFred Sportsbook. It is Friday, May 19th, 2023. People, I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody is having a great day, and I hope everybody is ready for what should be another FFE, a fun Friday edition of the Air Tour Sports Podcast. We have covered a lot of ground over the last two episodes, and we have a busy Friday episode for you. Here's what you need to know about today's show. We will open. NBA Draft Combine was this week. The lottery was a few days ago. And from the Combine perspective, what we're going to talk about is more the college basketball perspective. What players put themselves in position to maybe get drafted, which ones should come back, and what does it mean for college basketball as a whole? We'll talk Kentucky, Zach Edey and Purdue, Andre Jackson and UConn, Jordan Walsh in Arkansas, some other players that are now in the portal. What do they do? We'll hit on all the big players. What does it all mean? All that good stuff. From there, we'll take a quick break. And speaking of the portal, a player who was in the portal, then out, now he is back in again. It is Caleb Love. We all heard the story. What happened? What went wrong? Where should Caleb Love go? And who's to blame at Michigan? Is it Juwan Howard? Is it admissions? Is it a little bit of both? We will discuss that. And then finally, we will wrap. Normally do Aaron right, Aaron wrong. But today, I thought it was important that UConn Big 12 story. I talked about it a little bit on Wednesday's show, but I have seen a lot of bad reporting from a lot of media outlets that are supposed to know what's going on. So my job is to separate fact from fiction and let you know exactly what happened, what is going on with this UConn Big 12 stuff. What is the truth? What is not? And why would UConn even consider leaving the Big East after winning a national championship? It's a little bit more complicated than everyone is making it out to be. Busy show, as I said. Fun show, as I said, presented by BetFred Sportsbook, as I said. And so with that said, let's not waste any more time and let's get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day, listen, as I just said, to lead the show, we're going to talk NBA Draft Combine. Okay, so these are the weeks that the NBA draft stuff is really starting to pick up. Tuesday, we had the NBA Draft Lottery. We know the Spurs have the number one pick. As of right now, Charlotte to Portland 3, although Portland has said that they plan on trading the pick. But on top of the NBA Draft Lottery, they also have the NBA Draft Combine this weekend in Chicago as well. Now, this isn't quite as big as the NFL Combine. And what I would say about the NBA Draft Combine is that most of the best players, they kind of show up, maybe do some measurements, talk to the media, talk to the teams, but they don't really play or are active or participate. And so this week in Chicago, you're not going to see a Brandon Miller, a Victor Wembanyama, a Cason Wallace from Kentucky, and Anthony Black from Arkansas. Those guys aren't playing 5-on-5. They know they're going in the lottery. They know they're going early. There's nothing they can really do to help their NBA draft stock. So instead, they're sitting out. However, there were actually a lot of really relatively important players playing in the 5-on-5 portion of the NBA Draft Combine. Why that's important is because a good week in Chicago this week, it can shoot you up draft boards, and the possibility could exist that you would have the possibility of playing yourself into a prime draft position, meaning you might be leaving college basketball even if you weren't planning on it. And then, oh, by the way, there are the other guys who had a bad week. It didn't go as planned, and maybe they were planning on leaving college basketball, but instead will now return to college basketball. And so that is why this week in Chicago is important. And so what I want to do now is take just a few minutes to talk about all of the players that had a good week, bad week, and what it means for college basketball. Let's start with a team that I would argue outside of maybe Purdue, which has the National Player of the Year at the Combine. I would argue there's no team that has a bigger week and had a bigger week in Chicago than the Kentucky Wildcats. Kentucky has 3 players currently testing the NBA draft waters. 2 were in Chicago. 1 ended up playing. The guy who played is certainly the most high profile of the 3. It was Oscar Tshiebwe. Chris Livingston was also there, but chose not to participate in 5-on-5. And then Antonio Reeves, we all remember him, hot shooter at the guard position. I'm not saying he's hot or whatever. Point I'm trying to make, 37 points at Bud Walton Arena. He actually didn't even get an invite to the combine. My hunch is that in the next week or so, we will find out that he is returning. But from Kentucky's perspective, this week is really important because, as we've discussed, as of right now, Kentucky's roster currently looks like this. They have 5 freshmen committed, and they have 2 sophomores coming back who really didn't play all that much this year. So what Oscar Tshiebwe does, what Chris Livingston does, now I know there's still time in the portal. Keyshawn Johnson, will find out if he commits this weekend. We'll be reacting to it regardless of where he commits, but I think it's probably down to, my guess is Kentucky and Arizona at this point. Bottom line is Kentucky kind of needs some clarification on their guys. So let's talk about them, and let me start with Oscar Tshiebwe, because Oscar Tshiebwe, I give him credit. 1, he was willing to play 5-on-5, and 2, he kind of did what Oscar Tshiebwe does. He was great. He did all the little things. I think he probably showed a little bit more from a shooting perspective than I think a lot of people realize. But more than anything, he just rebounded the crap out of the ball. 16 rebounds on day 1, 9 rebounds on day 2 on Thursday. And so when I look at Oscar Tshiebwe, he is in a very interesting spot from the perspective of, does he return to college or does he go pro? Right now, the options are open. It is worth noting, by the way, because he is a graduate student, he could transfer. He said this week, no. If I go back to college, Kentucky's home. That's the only place I'm going. But what's also interesting, so he's not going to transfer. But what's also interesting, though, is that he did have a saying or a quote at the combine where he said, I believe that there is one NBA team that will fall in love with what I do. And if you listen to the quotes and if you read between the tea leaves, it sounds to me like this guy is ready to get his professional career started. Now, look, we all know the money that he made at Kentucky in NIL. We all know what he would make next year as the returning National Player of the Year. But as we've discussed on this show, it does feel like there's kind of a push-pull. Some Kentucky fans want him back. Many others are ready to start the post-Oscar years, if you will, kind of understanding that in 2 years with him at center, 2 NCAA tournaments, but 1 NCAA tournament win total. I fall somewhere in the middle. I do believe that probably, I don't think it would hurt to have a 5th-year senior with guys that are that young. I also think it's a little bit misleading to say that, oh, it's Oscar's fault that we did this or that in the tournament. I mean, listen, the guy was phenomenal last year in the tournament against St. Peter's. Wasn't their fault that they lost. And then this year, I've said it many times, but 1, they were leading Kansas State with under 4 minutes to go. And 2, Antonio Reeves and Jacob Toppin were basically no-shows. The only point I'm trying to make, it wasn't Oscar Tshiebwe's fault that you lost. Bottom line, though, this will be one to follow over the coming days because it obviously changes the trajectory of that team if he comes back. But if I had to take a guess right now, my guess is that he doesn't. Definitely worth monitoring. And again, he showed exactly who he is. And sometimes, listen, when you're talking about second-round NBA draft picks, yes, Oscar Tshiebwe is limited. Yes, he doesn't have elite length. Yes, he doesn't have elite defensive ability. But if you can do one thing, and if you're willing to play a role, there is a role for you in the NBA. My guess is if Oscar Tshiebwe stays in, he ends up as a second-round pick, but it is worth monitoring. Really quickly, the other Kentucky player, and again, Antonio Reeves is technically going through the process, but I'm not even going to talk about him because I suspect he'll be back. Chris Livingston, very strange week for him in Chicago. And so for people who don't know his story, freshman, McDonald's All-American, actually played very well down the stretch, but on the season only averaged 6 points, 4 rebounds per game. Yet he goes to Chicago and he doesn't even play 5-on-5. And so to me, that means either one of two things. Either he has an NBA draft guarantee or he's getting really bad advice. Now, is it possible that he does have that guarantee? Of course it is. He's 6'6". He's super athletic. I'm not sold that he showed anything this year that would make me feel confident that he is going to get picked somewhere in those 58, 59 picks. It's not quite 60 this year. There's some compensation issues, whatever. But I watch a lot of college basketball. I'm not sold he's going to be one of the 58, 59 guys picked in the middle of June, yet he didn't participate, and maybe it means something. but I also don't believe that he would be this deep into the process if he really planned on coming back. My hunch is that he's gone. And I think from Kentucky's perspective, you got to start, hammering that portal. Hope Keyshawn Johnson decides to become a Wildcat. If not, there are some other options. Arthur Kaluma from Creighton might be available. But I don't believe that Chris Livingston is coming back, but a strange week overall for him. Let's get to some other teams, some other college basketball teams who had players in Chicago and discuss what this week meant for them. Next team I want to discuss, it's an interesting one, certainly from my perspective, but I think from the college basketball perspective as a whole, and that is the reigning national champions, the UConn Huskies. UConn wins the championship the first week in April, and since then, Jordan Hawkins goes pro. Since then, Adama Sanogo goes pro and announces that he will not be coming back. And so in Chicago this week, you had Andre Jackson, a 6'8" junior, testing the waters, and you had Tristan Newton, another player who was at the G League Combine, but not at the NBA Combine over the last couple days. As far as Andre Jackson is concerned, he's a really interesting guy because throughout the year, he really talked about being back next year, being part of the program next year. But as UConn went on that NCAA tournament run, and as UConn won that championship, over time, it started to feel like his draft buzz, I think you could argue every player in the tournament, his draft buzz improved the most thanks to that run in the NCAA tournament. 6'8", playmaker, great hustle, great energy, intangibles guy. And it's like we just talked about with Oscar Tshiebwe. The bottom line is, once you get past those first couple picks, nobody's looking for a superstar. They want guys that will play a role, that do one or two things very well, and most importantly, that are comfortable playing roles, right? Because most guys that are getting to this point, they've been the superstar every level that they've been at. And Andre Jackson is not that guy. He has been a star, but a role-playing star, a guy that does all the little things for UConn. And so as we go through this draft process, my understanding just from talking to people and also just reading reports out of Chicago, I was not there. I think NBA teams are starting to fall for this guy because at this point, and by the way, I've talked to NBA people throughout the year that kind of said the same thing. Like basically like they knew about him, even though he wasn't playing well. And I think what's interesting about Andre Jackson is, to me, where we're at with him, NBA teams, in my opinion, are starting to get comfortable with who he is and who he isn't. In other words, yes, you would love in a perfect world for him to be a complete player. The one thing he does not do right now very well is shoot the three-pointer, 28-29% this season. Of course, if he shot the ball 28-29%, if he shot the ball 38-39% instead of 28-29%, he's probably not even playing at the combine. He's probably a top 10 pick. And frankly, if he shot the ball that well, he probably wouldn't even have been in college basketball this past year as a junior. So as time goes on, it feels to me more and more like Andre Jackson is getting more comfortable with the process, and teams are getting more comfortable with who he is and who he isn't. If I had to take a guess, Andre Jackson is probably done playing college basketball. It's worth noting that he hinted to reporters, probably this is it for me. UConn's going to be fine without me. So we'll see in the coming days. But my guess is that Andre Jackson is gone. My guess is that Tristan Newton is back. And I still think even without Andre Jackson, UConn's probably a top 5 to 7 team in college basketball next year. Although it's hard to make the argument they're number 1 or 2 without Andre Jackson. Speaking of number 1 or 2, if Purdue gets Zach Edey back, they're going to run it back completely with the exact same team that just won the Big Ten regular season, the Big Ten tournament. Now, we've discussed it many times. I get it. They lost early in the tournament, and they were probably a little bit overrated. But when you start talking about a team that could return literally everybody except for a guy off their bench named David Jenkins, that's probably the number 2, 3, 4, 5 team in the country going into next year. The question is Zach Edey going to return? Zach Edey was in Chicago. And I'll say this, it feels like he probably, 2 things. 1, played a little better than people expected. I'm not even played better. I guess what I would say is my hunch is that he's taking this process more seriously than I think I thought. Like, I thought coming in, okay, he's going to just do the little test thing just to say he did it, get feedback, and then come back to college. You listen to quotes, you listen to interviews from this week, it seems like he's 2 feet in, really seeing this process through. Doesn't mean that he's going to stay in the draft, just that it feels like it is further along than I think that I thought maybe 2-3 weeks ago. Worth noting, Zach Edey was asked about the NIL situation. Remember, he is from Canada, which means that he runs into the same problem as Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky, Adama Sanogo at UConn, where it's hard for him to do traditional NIL. He had to go to Canada to get stuff done. But he did say, Purdue is working hard to figure things out, to put me in a better position to make some money next year if I do return. So I think that's probably a factor worth monitoring, is that if he comes back, he's going to be in a better position financially playing college basketball, which is worth noting. A couple other players that are interesting. Marquette. We just talked about Purdue potentially returning everybody. Marquette can literally return everybody off a team that won the Big East regular season, Big East tournament. Remember, it wasn't UConn, even though they were the national champion. It wasn't UConn that won the Big East regular season. It wasn't UConn that won the Big East tournament. It was Marquette that won both. And Marquette actually beat UConn twice during the regular season, once in Milwaukee and then once in the Big East tournament. Well, they do have one player, Omax Prosper, who is in Chicago right now at the NBA Combine. And he played really, really, really well. Like, you read the reports, he was probably one of the breakout stars of this week. 6'8" forward, super athletic, 40+ vertical inch leap. And I have no personal insight into what he will do, but you talk about guys that helped themselves this week. Outside of Andre Jackson, Omax Prosper is probably the one that helped himself the most. My guess is that we've probably seen him play the last of college basketball. Marquette will still be good next year, but there's obviously no way to replace a guy of that caliber at this point in the offseason if he does, in fact, decide to leave. Really quickly, a couple other guys worth noting. Jordan Walsh from Arkansas. Remember, Arkansas technically has 2 guys testing on top of 4 guys that are at the combine or in the process full speed. So Anthony Black, Nick Smith, Ricky Council are so I should say 3 players are in and not coming back. Jordan Walsh and Devo Davis are both testing the process. Devo Davis did not get an invite to the combine. Jordan Walsh did, and early reports are that he looks really good, and he's probably a late first round, early second round pick. 6'8" forward. My hunch is that he probably stays in the draft. We will see. And remember, too, as I'm recording, Arkansas is still recruiting Ron Holland, that elite number 1 high school player in America. As of right now, he has not committed, but my guess is that he ends up at Arkansas. That's Ron Holland, which makes it make more sense that Jordan Walsh would leave. Speaking of Arkansas, Grant Nelson, the North Dakota State player, did not play well this week. He is a 6'10", super athletic player who played, as I said, the last 3 years at North Dakota. This is Grant Nelson, again, 6'11", from the lovely town of Devils Lake, North Dakota. We've talked about that before. Averaged 18 points, 9 rebounds per game. Was not great at the combine. My guess is he's coming back to college basketball. Now, why I said, speaking of Arkansas, is because Grant Nelson's name is currently in the transfer portal, and it'll be curious to see if he stays in the portal, if he goes back to North Dakota State. If he stays in the portal, the early indications are that Arkansas was a team that he was very interested in. So we'll see what happens there. Definitely worth keeping an eye on. A couple other names, Arthur Kaluma, another player from Creighton. He is in the transfer portal as well. Now, he probably wouldn't be an Arkansas guy, but if he decides to come back, I think Arizona's probably in the mix, whatever. We'll see. He did not have a great week at the combine. Speaking of Creighton, by the way, 2 players, their center Ryan Kalkbrenner played pretty well. Their starting combo guard probably will be the point guard next year. Trey Alexander was okay, but not great. Creighton needs both those guys to come back to be elite next year. We'll see what happens. Again, a third Creighton player, Arthur Kaluma, is in the portal. He will not come back to Creighton if he returns to college basketball. Did not play well. And then finally, this is not a combine note, but a player worth keeping an eye on. Lamont Butler, tournament hero from San Diego State. I have been told he is very impressive in these workouts. Elite 2-way guard. didn't average a bunch of points. But listen, San Diego State plays a million guys, and this was one of the best defensive guards in college basketball. He's had a bunch of workouts, and I thought as of a month ago, he was just testing kind of like a Zach Edey. I think there's at least a chance that he stays in. All right, this is what I want to do. Good segment, by the way. Great segment. Hopefully that was a good segment. So I'm going to do, take a quick break. When I come back, we're going to talk about a player that is definitely not testing. That is Caleb Love. What is next for him after Michigan? No go. We're going to discuss it all. Take a quick break. Be right back. All right, we're getting back to the show in a minute. But before we do, I want to welcome back our presenting sponsor, BetFred Sportsbook, and the BetFred Sportsbook app. The NBA playoffs are here, and nobody has you covered quite like BetFred. By now, you know BetFred's story. Started in 1967 in the UK. Over 1,200 shops in the UK. They have since come to the United States and made a major splash. They are not only the presenting sponsor of the Aaron Torres podcast and all things Aaron Torres media, but also the Cincinnati Bengals, the Colorado Rockies, the Denver Broncos. And what I love about BetFred Sportsbook is that nobody takes care of their customers quite like BetFred. You've seen the BetFred Sportsbook suite at Bengals games. It is hopping. We have sent listeners of this show to Denver Broncos VIP tailgates. BetFred bettors have thrown out first pitches at Colorado Rockies games. Again, nobody takes care of you like BetFred Sportsbook does. And here is what they are doing for the NBA playoffs. How about this for a deal? Bet $50 on any game all playoffs long. Get up to $1,111 in free bets. Here's how it works. Download the BetFred Sportsbook app. Bet $50 on any game. You automatically get $111 in free bets. But beyond that, here is what else BetFred does for you. They're going to give you up to $200 in insurance for the first 5 weeks that you're a BetFred customer. So maybe you make a bad pick. We all do. We've all been there. Trust me. You followed my picks in March Madness. It happens. So you bet 200, doesn't work out. Get 200 insurance for the first 5 weeks that you are a BetFred customer, equating up to $1,111 in free bets thanks to BetFred. Again, nobody takes care of you like BetFred does. Love working with them. They are the presenting sponsor of the Aaron Torres pod. Tell them Torres sent you. Download the BetFred Sportsbook app right now, everybody. I'm back. Good to be back. Do want to switch gears, and I'll just say this, man. It is wild to me how much content keeps falling in our laps here in now mid to late May. Just when you think the content well is drying up, something crazy happens. And that was certainly the case on Wednesday, involving a basketball player that we've talked about a lot on this show over the last couple months, and that is Caleb Love. By now, if you're listening to a show like this, you probably know Caleb Love's story, but played at North Carolina, 3-year starter for that program, and really, frankly, was part of some really iconic moments for North Carolina basketball. He was a guy that was part of a team that not only went to a Final Four, but beat Coach K in Coach K's final game as a college basketball coach. Caleb Love was basically the guy that hit the dagger to send Coach K into retirement. 28 points versus Duke, 30 points earlier in the tournament versus UCLA. And really, again, an incredible sophomore season that also didn't translate into this junior year. Did average just under 17 points per game, but 38% from the field, 29.9% shooting from three. And after the season, he decided to enter the portal. And I think we all were a little bit surprised, but we sort of got it. Something was clearly not right at Carolina. Caleb Love is going to look for other options. Well, a few weeks after he entered the portal, Caleb Love did publicly announce a commitment. It was to the University of Michigan. And at that point, I think we all thought the Caleb Love story was done, right? He's going to Michigan. We'll talk about him in the fall. We'll see if he has any success and what it means for Michigan going forward. Just one problem. Over the last couple weeks, we've started to hear some whispers in the streets that maybe Caleb Love was going to have some sort of issue, not going to go to Michigan. And then on Wednesday, we got the bombshell of all bombshells, as Joe Tipton, I believe, was the first one. The guy, Trilly Donovan, has been doing incredible work on this story. Want to make sure I credit the right people. But that Caleb Love will not be going to Michigan, with CBS's Matt Norlander, I believe, was the first one to report that it is over an administrative issue and some of his transfer credits coming into school. And so with it, Caleb Love is again on the free agent market. And what I want to do now is talk about where Caleb Love might end up. But just as importantly, what the heck is going on at Michigan? How do you let this happen? And what does a program that could deal with no negative news right now? It's a bad time for Michigan basketball. How do you let this situation get so bad? And what do you do from here? As far as Caleb Love is concerned, listen, he's not going back to North Carolina. I saw multiple reports reflect that. And obviously it's too late to enter the NBA draft. So he doesn't have to re-enter the portal because he already entered the portal. But now it becomes a question of where is he going to end up next? Now, my hunch, my personal opinion, I have not talked to anybody close to Caleb Love or anything like that. But the school that to me made the most sense when he entered the first time, and certainly makes the most sense now, is the Missouri Tigers. And for people who don't know the backstory, Caleb Love is from the state of Missouri. So there is a natural fit there. And I also think beyond that, Dennis Gates, to me, is the perfect coach for Caleb Love. Caleb Love, listen, there are incredibly high peaks and there are incredibly low valleys with Caleb Love. And the key to coaching Caleb Love, at least from a distance, how I perceive it, is you have to be able to find that happy medium. You have to let Caleb Love be Caleb Love, allow him to be the guy that averaged 17 points per game in the ACC this year, dropped 28 in a Final Four game. But also when he has those 2-3 bad possessions in a row, you kind of got to be the guy that is going to hold him accountable and say, you know what, come sit beside me for a few minutes. Think about what you did. I'm putting you in timeout and it's time for you to reconsider. And then we'll put you back in a minute or two. And so to me, Missouri always made the most sense because one, being a St. Louis area kid born in St. Louis, my guess is there are probably some great NIL opportunities for him at Missouri. I also believe that he can maybe be the face of that Missouri program going to another level. Incredible first season under Dennis Gates. They go to the NCAA tournament. They win a tournament game. If Caleb Love has the kind of tournament he did at North Carolina, that's the kind of guy that can take a tournament team and turn them into a second weekend team playing who knows where. I know Missouri, they've made a few Elite Eights. I don't believe they've ever made a Final Four, but that's the kind of guy. If he has a hot 4, 5, 6 game stretch, all of a sudden you can be in the Sweet 16 playing to go to the Elite Eight. You can be in the Elite Eight playing to go to the Final Four. That is the kind of talent that he has. And so I don't know what he's going to do, but Missouri always made the most sense. And now even more maybe than when he entered the portal originally, it feels like it even makes more sense now than it did 6 weeks ago. Missouri has been kind of the bridesmaid, if you will, of this portal cycle. They've finished second or third on a lot of players they've wanted. Now, they've gotten a few. John Tanji from Colorado State is a really good player. But also, I know for a fact they wanted Matt Cleveland really bad. From Florida State, ends up going to Miami. They wanted Caden Shedrick, was coming from Virginia, ended up at Texas. So Missouri has missed on a lot of guys. This feels like a guy they can get. This feels like a guy they kind of need at this point in the cycle. If it's not Missouri, I'll be blunt. There's a couple other schools that recruited him the first time around that makes sense. Memphis, probably, they're pretty good in the guard spot with Caleb Mills. So it would be a Caleb backcourt, Caleb Mills and Caleb Love. Indiana recruited him the first time around. It was kind of a hot and cold recruitment. At one point, you thought it was going to happen. At another point, it was clear that it wasn't. Don't know if they'd get back in the mix. So Caleb Love is going to have suitors because at the end of the day, listen, you can argue about the downside, but the upside is a guy that has performed at the highest level in college basketball's biggest moments. This is not a guy that you're taking from Grand Canyon or from the MAC or from the Big Sky, and you're hoping if you bring him to an Indiana, a Michigan, a Memphis, a Missouri, that he can play at that level or that he can compete or that he won't be afraid of the moment. That's a guy that can compete and won't be afraid of the moment. And that's why I'm intrigued to see what he could potentially do at another spot. I'll also say, though, really quick before we get out of here, as interesting as the Caleb Love perspective is on this, the Michigan perspective is also very interesting as well, because you don't need me to tell you, it has not been a good, really 2.5 years since that magical 2021 season for Juwan Howard. If you remember, that 2021 season. It was his second year. It was that COVID season, but he brought back a bunch of players that had played under John Beilein, added a few key pieces of his own, making Elite Eight. And since then, it's kind of been a disaster, right? Last year, you sneak into the NCAA tournament in 2022 as an 11 seed. Now, they didn't make the Sweet 16, but they were still an 11 seed. This year, you missed the NCAA tournament with probably 2 first-round picks, Jett Howard, your son, Kobe Buffkin, another guard who is probably going to be a first-round pick. You have Hunter Dickinson. Well, now Hunter Dickinson enters the transfer portal. He's complaining about your NIL setup. And really, it's just a really bad offseason. And the hope is that Caleb Love him or hate him, no pun intended, is kind of the guy that can fix the problems that you have at least for one season. Because while Caleb Love has his issues, the one thing Michigan needs or needed and now needs again is a guy that can fill up the basket and put the ball in the basket. And that's exactly what Caleb Love can do. And now he's not there. And now I don't really know what you do. And beyond that, I'll be blunt. I don't really know who you even blame in a situation like this. Now, it's interesting because to me, just checking the climate, it feels like everybody falls into one of two camps. It's either one, you blame Michigan admissions. They're a disaster. They're a train wreck. Remember last year, Michigan wanted to get in Terrence Shannon Jr., a top transfer from Texas Tech, who couldn't get in. There was issues of what was Texas Tech doing? Were they holding him back? But Michigan couldn't get him in. Now you have the Caleb Love situation. So some people are on the admissions is all to blame. Others are, it's Juwan Howard. And I'll tell you, I fall somewhere in the middle, but this does fall on the head coach, Juwan Howard, and let me explain why. And so after all this happened, I went ahead and I made a few phone calls and I talked to a few people just to try to get a feel for how does this process work. And what I can tell you is every school is a little bit different in terms of what admissions is cool with and what they're not. But usually somebody on the staff at least has an understanding of what's going on. So I'll give you an example. I talked to one staff this week after all this happened. They said, our admissions is cool on 2 fronts. If you're a graduate transfer, we can get you in. If you are a guy that just finished his freshman or sophomore year, we can get you in. Where the issue becomes, it's hard for us to get in a 3rd or 4th year guy because our school wants a maximum number of credits. And ultimately they want you to be in school with us for 2-3 years so that you actually kind of quote unquote earn the degree. That was one school I talked to. Then I talked to another one that was like undergrad transfers, no problem at all. Graduate transfers, that's where it becomes difficult because we have a very competitive graduate program and our graduate school isn't going to let in a basketball or a football or a tennis or a golf player, whatever, that's going to go to school for 6 months in a program that is 2 or 3 years. So I don't mean to belabor the point, but why I bring it up is because every school is a little bit different. Every school is a little bit different, but the one thing you need to do as a coaching staff is you need to have an understanding of what is going to fly with your admissions and what isn't. And so I would probably lean a little bit on Juwan Howard here because either you have to know that you can get him in when you take him, or 2, you tell Caleb Love, listen, we want you. Do not put out a graphic. Do not make the public announcement until we know for sure you can get in. So regardless of who's to blame, it is just a disastrous situation for Michigan. And I'll be blunt, I don't know where they go from here. Now, I know they had another transfer on campus over the last couple of days, Ray J. Dennis, guard from Toledo. But man, that team needs talent, and they need talent in a hurry. Cannot believe that we are here. Disastrous for Michigan. And now we got a couple more days of Caleb Love content on this show because Caleb Love all of a sudden is available again. Final segment of the show, final segment of the week. So good to be back. And I do want to wrap. I know that generally on Fridays we do Aaron Right, Aaron Wrong to wrap every Friday, but it's a little bit of a slower Friday. Not as much. Let's be honest. I wasn't really wrong on anything this week. I'm awesome. No, I'm kidding. That's a slight exaggeration, but we'll get back to Aaron Right, Aaron Wrong next Friday because there is one more topic that I want to get to. And it is actually something that we discussed a little bit on Wednesday's Aaron Torres pod, and it involves that lengthy expansion college sports realignment article that Ross Dellinger from Sports Illustrated put out. So if you listen to Wednesday's show, I did a very long segment on it. It honestly probably went a little too long. But either way, we talked a lot about the ACC. We talked a lot about the Pac-12. And at the end, I mentioned a little nugget about UConn and the Big 12. At least, they're looking at each other from across the bar. I'm not saying the Big 12 has come all over and offered to buy a drink. I'm not saying that UConn slipped some digits to the Big 12. I'm just saying that it was in the article, and I talked about it on Wednesday's show. Here's the thing. Since I did that show, there has been a lot, let's be honest, of very bad and uninformed reporting on UConn's current situation. Basically, everybody in the national media has used that one little nugget to basically say, UConn, you'd be crazy to leave the Big East. You left the Big East once. Don't ever do it again. And so what I want to do is I want to do a little bit of fact and fiction on this UConn Big 12 story. Now, I'll readily admit it is my school, but I can also tell you I have some pretty high-level contacts at the school. I'm not bragging. It's just a fact. And the idea that is being floated out by the national media, outside of me, of course, is basically, I think it's completely wrong. And so let's get into it. Let's dive in and let's discuss. And let's start with the concept that most of the national media seems to believe as to why these conversations are happening. The concept is pretty straightforward. It is that UConn left the Big East once to chase football glory in the AAC. And the idea that has been floated by Pat Forty at ESPN, by The Athletic, is that UConn is pursuing the Big 12, or the conversations are happening because they again want to pursue football glory. Essentially, they're saying this basketball thing is fun, but the Big East has been cool, but let's go back to trying to chase football glory. And so what I can tell you, that is not accurate at all. That is not the way the athletic department is thinking. And so again, let's get into some fact and fiction. First off, and UConn fans know this, but a lot of people don't. Let's make one thing clear. UConn did not leave the Big East the first time. The Big East became a basketball-only league, or a no football league. And so if you played FBS football, they didn't have a home for you. Central Florida got kicked out. Cincinnati got kicked out. Whatever. And UConn was one of the teams that didn't have a home. And so they didn't leave the Big East. They got kicked out, essentially. Two, let's also call a spade here. When UConn went to the AAC then and now is not what the Big 12 is or will be if UConn ever enters that conference. And I'm not saying that it's done or it will happen, but the Big 12 is a lot different. Now, is the Big 12 the SEC? Is it the Big 10? It isn't. But what the Big 12 is a steady conference. And that, by the way, was the entire Ross Dellinger article, right? The entire Ross Dellinger article was basically everybody that's not in the SEC or the ACC is doing whatever they can to find a landing spot that is stable ground. That the ACC is kind of on shaky ground. The Pac-12 is definitely on shaky ground, and everybody's trying to find a landing spot. The Big 12 would provide that because the Big 12 is going to be in its current existence for the foreseeable future. Long-term TV contract, ESPN, Fox, they're good to go. So let's eliminate the thought that UConn voluntarily left the Big East the first time, and that the Big 12 currently, or in a year or two or 5 or 10 or whatever, is the same as what the AAC was a few years ago. Much more money involved in the Big 12 if UConn one day gets there. And to be clear, not saying UConn will be. Big 12's got to figure out what they're doing with some of those Pac-12 schools. They've talked to San Diego State. They've talked to Gonzaga as a basketball-only member. So to be clear, again, there's a lot to be figured out. But that last part is the important part. It is the money that we are discussing when it comes to leaving the Big East potentially for the Big 12. Here is the bottom line with the Big East, okay? It's hard to find exact numbers on what Big East schools are making. I actually spent quite a bit of time looking it up, over the last couple, hours or so before I started the show. And as best I can tell, the Big East TV contract currently pays somewhere in the neighborhood of between $5 and $10 million a year. $5 and $10 million a year. So even if the higher side of that contract is $10 million, and I understand that there are other streams of revenue, ticket sales, merchandise, donations, etc., you're still talking about a third of what the Big 12 is going to get, and pennies on the dollar compared to what some of these other schools in the Big 10 and the SEC will be making in a year or two when their new TV contracts kick in. And so I bring it up because when the national media, except for me, because I'm smart and I actually talk to sources and stuff like that, when the national media is trying to tell you UConn is chasing football glory going to the Big 12, no, it's actually the exact opposite. UConn has one of the best across-the-board athletic departments in the country. But to keep it elite in basketball, women's basketball, baseball's in the top 25, men's ice hockey was in the top 15 this year, women's ice hockey was very good. It's actually not about football at all. It's about doing what it takes to protect all of those other sports, because if you are men's basketball and you want to compete at the highest level with the Indianas, the Kentuckys, the Purdues, the UCLA, which is going to the Big 10, it's going to be hard to do it on a seventh or eighth of the money that they're making. And I'll give you an example, and I used this example on Wednesday's show. Let's say in a year from now, there's an SEC basketball power that could conceivably need a new head basketball coach. Now, I'm not saying John Calipari is definitely out after this year at Kentucky. And I'm not saying that Dan Hurley would be Kentucky's first choice. But imagine the scenario where it doesn't work for Cal. He announces, it's time, I'm going to step into my administrative role. And Kentucky starts putting together their list of candidates. Now, first of all, I think Dan Hurley is about to get a massive extension this offseason, a massive raise. Keep this number in the back of your head. When it comes out, I bet he's a $6 million a year head coach. That, by the way, on an $8, $9, $10 million a year TV budget. But let's say Kentucky needs a new head coach in a year. Or my boy Mike Effin Woodson retires at Indiana. And Indiana's making $90 million a year in TV money. Or Ohio State needs a new head coach. Or pretty much pick any Big 10 or SEC school. UCLA, Big Mick Energy, Mick Cronin decides to do something else. And UCLA needs a coach. Any of those schools can write any check they need. So if Kentucky deems, let's say a year from now, Kentucky, John Calipari moves on. And Kentucky deems that Dan Hurley is the man that they need to replace John Calipari going forward. Not saying it would happen. Not saying he'd be their number one candidate. But let's just say that's the scenario. And let's say Kentucky says, Coach Hurley, here's a check, fill in the zeros. And as I said on Wednesday, they offer him a 10-year, $80 million contract. $8 million a year for the next decade, which isn't inconceivable, by the way. Calipari's on $8, $9 million a year. So that isn't inconceivable that Kentucky could offer Dan Hurley the same thing or more. Or maybe it's an 8-year, $80 million deal, $10 million a year. UConn's a basketball school with basketball tradition, with basketball fan base. UConn cannot match that salary. And if Kentucky has success next year and John Calipari stays, what happens if North Carolina, making $30+ million a year in TV money, offers the same contract? Or Indiana offers the same contract? Or UCLA offers the same contract? Or Kansas, making $30+ million a year in the Big 12, offers that same contract? UConn can't compete. I'll take it a step further. We are headed towards an NIL free-for-all going forward. And I know it's been a conversation. I know nobody knows exactly what everybody's getting, and this guy's supposed to be getting this, and that guy's supposed to be getting that, and the school can't be involved. But listen, the bottom line is it's all hands on deck money-wise. And if you're making $10 million a year and you're paying your basketball coach $6 million, or you got to pay him $8 million now because somebody came out and you got to match him, what happens with your other sports? By the way, I should mention, again, UConn's elite in a lot of sports. Their baseball is in the top 20 right now. Michigan came after their baseball coach, Jim Penders, last offseason. Jim Penders said, thanks, but no thanks. What happens if an SEC school says, you know what? This guy's winning in Connecticut. Let's bring him down to Mississippi State, which I'm told we'll need a baseball coach after this year, even winning the national championship 2 years ago. Alabama's going to be looking for a new baseball coach. I don't know what the market is for baseball coaches, but I'm guessing if Alabama thinks that UConn's baseball coach is the guy, they can pay whatever it takes. Same with Mississippi State, same with Georgia, same with whomever. And so you start to add up the money. That is why UConn would consider the Big 12, because it's about paying your coaches. It's about facilities. It's about not falling behind in NIL. Dan Hurley had an interesting interview a few weeks ago where he said, look, we don't want kids picking us solely because of NIL, but we don't want to lose kids because we can't compete either in that space. So there's a lot of moving parts with finances right now. And so this is why UConn is considering the Big 12, or at least willing to listen if the Big 12 came in and wanted to have a conversation. To be clear, doesn't mean anything's going to happen. And to be clear, by the way, and I think this is an important point, it's not as though the UConn fan base is in universal agreement. I would probably venture to guess it's probably 60-40 fans that understand the economics, that understand that to stay at the highest level, it might not be in the Big East, versus those that are saying, we did leave once and it didn't work out well. We don't want to risk it again. We're winning in basketball. That's what matters. But again, to continue to compete at this level, by the way, at some point, Gino Auriemma is going to retire. You're going to have to pay a lot of money to the next person to make sure that they keep the program elevated the way that he has had it for the last 30 years. Baseball is a factor. Hockey is a factor. I'm just saying this is why UConn is considering the Big 12. Not saying it will happen, not saying it's definitive. What I am saying is there are legitimate reasons that are not being reported on. And Torres, Colin Cowherd calls himself America's truth broker. Well, I am America's truth broker on UConn athletics. All right, I think that's it for this episode of the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. It is time for me to get out of here. Before I leave, I want to remind everybody, make sure you're subscribed. Aaron Torres Pod. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Music, wherever you listen to podcasts, make sure to subscribe. Also, make sure to rate and review the show. Go ahead and give us a quick 5 stars. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, all that good stuff. Make sure you're following on social media at Aaron_Torres on Twitter. We got all our Torres on accounts, Torres on Bama, Torres on the Hogs, Torres on the Vols, Torres on UConn, Torres on Arizona, etc. Make sure you're following those accounts. Make sure you're following on YouTube. About to hit 23K subscribers. Cannot thank you all enough for your support. It is time for me to get out of here. Thank you again for all that you guys and girls do. And I'll be back on Monday. Shout out to Torrin Craig. Shout out to Rachel, who hates my voice. Shout out to JJ Redick. You F-head, unblock me, bro. I'll be back on Monday. New episode, Aaron Torres Pod.